this one. But first, I want to talk about what has to be the most outrageous statement made yet. And that's saying a lot by President Obama. And maybe more amazing than the statement itself is the lack of outrage on the part of the media to criticize the president's obvious complete lack of understanding of basic U.S. history or even, eighth grade civics. The president proves that he doesn't know anything about U.S. history, that he doesn't know anything about the role of the Supreme Court in the United States. He is the president. He is in charge of the executive branch, yet doesn't even know anything about the separation of powers doctrine, doesn't know anything about the idea of judicial review. Now, the only explanation other than a complete ignorance of what Obama said is that maybe President Obama is kind of like Will Ferrell's character in Anchorman. Maybe he just reads whatever's on a teleprompter and just doesn't bother to even pay attention to what it is he's reading, because that's the only excuse that would make sense if he wants to argue that. But first, let us play the sound clip. And a clip I'm talking about, the president is talking about Obamacare and the fact that the Supreme Court might strike it down for being unconstitutional. And listen to what President Obama has to say about that potential outcome. It's cut number 8.
Ultimately, I'm confident that the Supreme Court will not take what would be an unprecedented, extraordinary step of overturning a law that was passed by a strong majority of a democratically elected Congress.
There are so many things wrong with that statement. I don't even know where to begin, but let me begin with just the simplest mistake he made. He claims that Obamacare was passed by an overwhelming majority. Overwhelming majority? I mean, it was passed. It was a strictly partisan vote. In the House of Representatives, the vote was 219 to 212. So what did it pass by? 6 votes, 7 votes? That's an overwhelming majority? I mean, what is he kidding? I mean, come on, it squeaked by. It was approved based on a party lines. Plus, it's unpopular, the majority of the American public. So to say that this is some overwhelmingly popular piece of legislation that swept through, on a tide of bipartisan support is ridiculous. But let's go to the more substantive errors here. President Obama said that this would be an unprecedented thing if the Supreme Court were to strike this down. Now, maybe the president doesn't understand the definition of the word unprecedented, because unprecedented means without precedent, right? It means it hasn't happened before. It would mean that the Supreme Court was blazing into uncharted territory. For the first time, it would be declaring a law unconstitutional that was passed by Congress. What, is he kidding? I mean, that's why the Supreme Court is there. I mean, every basic 7th or 8th grader who takes a civics course knows that that's what the Supreme Court does. I mean, as ignorant as most Americans are about the Constitution, they at least know that. I mean, they at least heard of Marbury versus Madison, which is a case that everybody learns about. Chief Justice John Marshall, the first time the Supreme Court struck down an unconstitutional law and established the precedent. That's why the Supreme Court is there. I mean, what does he think they're there to do? Rubber stamp everything that Congress passes, or just check the math and make sure that they got the right number of votes? But think about history. Think about all the big pieces of legislation that were struck down. I think probably the biggest example was the income tax. Congress initially passed an income tax in 1894, and the Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional in U.S. versus Pollock. And that's why we had a 16th Amendment, because once the law was struck down, Congress then amended the Constitution so that they can pass a later income tax. So there is huge precedent for the Supreme Court striking down unconstitutional laws. What about during the Great Depression? The NRA, National Labor Recovery Act, or whatever was the acronym, that was declared to be unconstitutional. In fact, the Supreme Court was striking down a lot of the New Deal programs. That's why Roosevelt threatened to pack the court and basically got them to stop doing this. But there is a lot of precedent. Now, where the president may have had a point, he could have said, in recent history, the Supreme Court has developed a precedent of allowing unconstitutional laws to stand. He could maybe have said that, and so that what this would be a break from the more recent precedent of the Supreme Court ignoring the Constitution. But to say that this would be unprecedented, as if this would be the first time in U.S. history that the Supreme Court would strike down a law that Congress passed. Imagine if Sarah Palin had said something this stupid when she was running for vice president. They would have crucified her in the press for her lack of knowledge or understanding of the Constitution, of the separation of powers, of judicial review. They would have said, how could she possibly seek the nation's second highest office when she knows nothing about how the U.S. government functions? Well, here we have a sitting U.S. president who knows nothing about how the U.S. government functions, knows nothing about the separation of powers, knows nothing about judicial review, knows nothing about the history of this country, the history of the Supreme Court, the history of things like the income tax. I mean, come on. Is the press really going to give the president a pass on this? And why are they going to do it? Break. Was talking again about President Obama's outrageous statement regarding the Supreme Court, proving he has very little knowledge of the history of the country that he is governing. And the question is, why? Where's the outrage? Why isn't the media criticizing the president?